Real questions, real answers for real life. Come on in and pull up a chair. You're at 1850 Main Street with Michael DelGiorno and David Zanotti.
Today we're talking about Israel with Dr. James Carafano. Lieutenant Colonel Carafano served 25 years in the U.S. military, has taught at the U.S. Naval War College and West Point, and is a vice president at the Heritage Foundation.
So, James, I guess let's start with a big picture. You've taught in War College. You're a student of history, and you have been a foreign policy analyst. Whenever we get to the Middle East, it gets everyone's attention, especially when they start viewing this in terms of biblical prophecy and so on. Let's just do this from a war standpoint. Big picture, what's happening and how concerned should we be?
Yeah, so I will paint for you what I think is the worst case scenario, and which I think is actually very reasonable, which is, why would Hamas do this? They know that they're going to get hammered by the Israelis. Hezbollah knows if they attack, they're going to take tremendous casualties. So why this? Why now? And I think the answer is Iran. So I think the reality is Iran, as we all know, Iran has been empowered and enabled by this administration over the last 2 years. They've made tens of billions of dollars in oil revenue, which had vanished under the previous administration. They basically got the U.S. government to crawl on glass to offer them $6 billion for hostages. So Iran felt greatly empowered, and I think they thought that this is the perfect time. So they have Hamas start a war in the south. Then once the Israelis counterattack, they have Hezbollah attack in the north. Look, they're not going to destroy Israel in the near term, but I think the goal here is the Israelis are greatly weakened. The United States is humiliated as a regional power. And then at that moment, Iran, right in the middle of an election campaign, U.S. presidential campaign, just declares it's a nuclear power. And, Biden will blink and not do anything in the middle of an election. And then a new president will walk in and Iran will have been an established nuclear power. So I think that's the scenario here. And I think from the Iranian perspective is, what do we have to lose if conditions aren't right after Hezbollah and Hamas attack? I'll declare nuclear status another time. But I think that's the game that's afoot.
And this goes back even to the Barack Obama administration, really, where it began in buying the time for Iran. Iran with nuclear weapons as a nuclear threat, unacceptable. What does that do to the world? Because that's the unspoken worst case scenario.
We keep saying that it's unacceptable, and yet just this week they allowed restrictions on Iranian purchases of ballistic missiles to lapse. Under this administration, remember we said, we're going to allow Iran to enrich because they're going to build a commercial nuclear energy thing. And this way they want the security of their own nuclear fuel. So we're going to permit that. We're going to give that to them. So what are they up to today? They're up to 80% enrichment, which is virtually there to build a nuclear weapon, which is so many factors greater than you would need for a commercial nuclear power plant. I mean, the joke is literally over, and literally they are at breakout point. And we keep saying it's unacceptable that Iran's a nuclear power. Yet we've done everything to set them up to do that. And what are we going to do when that happens?
All right. So David brought up this question about Shiites versus Sunnis, and there's actually a pre-question in terms of fighting two proxy wars at once and prioritizing Israel over Ukraine, which we'll get to in a little bit. But kind of walk David through, at first when Hamas did this, I thought, okay, this is their way of, they've been lost on the international scene and status quo. It's time to shake things up and get some attention. But now it seems far more coordinated. And I think just kind of like trying to figure out the errant missile, it's apparent to everyone that you're right. This is about Iran. It's an Iran play through Hezbollah. It's an Iran play, really, quite frankly, through Hamas. Walk him through the difference when we're dealing in terms of offensive attacks and ultimate military motives. I've always, from spending time with you, assumed that a Sunni is more political, patient. They wait for timing. Shiites are far more aggressive in their theology, that by taking these offensive actions, they're bringing about their ultimate goal, which is world rule and the appearance of a hidden imam and all that. It's interesting and concerning to me that they're coordinating together. So let's dust out the difference usually between a Shiite-created offensive versus a Sunni-created offensive. And is that even on the plate for you?
Well, so what's interesting, this is what makes the Middle East so complicated, because there are all these universes that exist in the Middle East simultaneously. There are still, for example, tribal influences, right? What really matters is the tribe. We've seen that actually reemerge in a pronounced way in Iraq. In some places, it's almost political and almost anachronistic. But in other places, tribal bonds matter more than anything else. There is the Sunni Shia divide, right? And this has started as a religious divide between two branches of the Islam religion, but it became rooted as a geopolitical divide, because the one branch was kind of situated in the Persian Empire, and the other branch was in the Arab states in the south. So it's both a political and a religious and a cultural divide. Then, of course, there are nation states, right? Then there are also great powers at play, and it's just not the United States presence. I mean, Russia's tried to be resurgent in the region. China's trying to gain influence in the region, and then there's this ideological divide that's always existed in the Middle East between essentially modernity, right? The idea of let's become a normal country like everybody else, right? And the idea of traditional Arab culture, which rejects commercialism and all Western values and everything else. All these things are bubbling simultaneously, and they have different influences at different times. So I think when you look at the relationship between Palestinians, who are largely Sunni Muslims, right, completely different branch of the majority of Iranians who are Shia, why are they colluding together? And the answer is because the Palestinians in Hamas, even the Palestinian Authority, certainly Hezbollah, they would not be forces to reckon with without the cash that's funneled them through Iran. And the one reason why they have become less demonstrative in recent years was because under the previous administration, they so cracked down on Iranian sources of revenue that Iran did not really have the money to spare.
I had a youth pastor when I was younger, always used to try to help me when I was young see that life's about good, better, and best. And sometimes good is as good as it can be. Sometimes better is better than good. And sometimes you can achieve best. But to kind of keep that focus. So in the course of this conversation, why don't we use the reverse of that, which is bad, worse, and worst. Right. You brought up a worst case scenario concerning Iran. I always view it as bad is somebody is misbehaving and they're a threat to stability and security. Worse is when I see all these different Muslim sects starting to work together. When I see Shiites and Sunnis together, Islamic Jihad, Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, Taliban, all kind of working together. That's worse. The worst is when I know China and Russia are backing all of them united. That, as you know, is a checkmate play. What are you seeing? Because I'm getting concerned now that I'm seeing Hezbollah coordinating and working to the north as Hamas is working from the Palestinian territory. I'm starting to see them all unite. That's not good.
So, when you to bring in kind of the great power competition, what is the trick question? What is the one thing that Iran and Russia and China all have in common? And that is that they see the achievement of their goals and their power and security in a diminished United States. So they all have their own interests. In some places, their interests actually conflict. But what they all share in common is they all want to see America weakened and withdrawn.
You taught war college. You taught history. How's that any different than the enemy of my enemy is my friend?
Well, yeah. Well, but sometimes they kind of are friends too. But Russia, in particular in this campaign, it's very obvious because what's interesting is the Russians and the Chinese have traditionally, in the past few decades, tried to make nice with Israel. Now, remember, in the Soviet Union, in the days of the Soviet Union, the Soviets made a strategic decision, since the United States had become an ally of Israel, that they would essentially align with the Arab states. and destroy Israel. And that was the way to get the U.S. out of the region. And so we had this situation where you had the Arab nations aligning with the Soviets for a large part. The Egyptians did it. And then, of course, that didn't really work. The Russians never effectively, after the 70s, the Reagan era, never effectively competed with us in the Middle East. And then they actually made nice with the Israelis. That was their way of competing with the United States. But we'll make nice with the Israelis too. Now they have completely thrown the Israelis overboard for Hamas. Why is that? And the answer is very simple. They want to distract attention and effort from Ukraine. And so they're hoping that the war in the Middle East weakens support and attention to dealing with Ukraine. And it's interesting because the Israelis have actually been fairly cool on Ukraine. They haven't been anti-Ukrainian, but they haven't given them any aid. They haven't done a lot. They kind of kept their quiet because they've got this relationship with the Russians. And so now the Russians literally kind of stabbed them in the back, right? Supported Hamas. So that's that. The Chinese, this would be awesome for them to expand their influence and attention in the region. So they also have courted the Israelis. They tried to buy the port in Haifa and other things. They haven't been super successful in the Middle East because most people in the Middle East don't need their money, right?
Right. So,
but they've always been trying to crack open doors, and so they actually have been also very cool on the Israelis. Again, their hope is that the U.S. is going to come out the big loser here, that our influence will be weakened, and that what other countries do is they will turn to the Chinese for support to hedge against the withdrawal of the United States. So ironically, even though the Chinese are all in bed with the Iranians, they'd be thrilled if the Iranians go nuclear. They then hope that the Arab states will then turn to them as a protector against Iran. Just kind of interesting.
Michael began in talk radio over 30 years ago. David has been working in the field of public policy and media for over 40 years. They've been around and seen a lot. To learn more about Michael and David, visit 1850mainstreet.com.
So my question is, it appears that Iran being a nuclear power is inevitable. When did it become inevitable? At what point in time did the ability to stop them leave the room?
So it's never inevitable. It's not inevitable, until the day they've decided. And this is, I think, one of the things that's always been wrong about analysts when they've looked at Iranian nuclear policy is that they've always assumed that it was some kind of conveyor belt, and that if we did a lot, we would slow it down. If we did less, it would speed up, right? But the reality is it's not a conveyor belt, and it hasn't been for several years. It absolutely, the day Biden walked in office, essentially gave them, it's not. I mean, they can be a nuclear power whenever they want. It's a political decision, a strategic decision, not a capabilities decision. And it's been that way for quite some time. And so if you want to keep Iran from going nuclear, the one way to do that is convince them that the costs of becoming a declared nuclear power are higher than the benefits of it becoming.
That's no different than North Korea, right?
Exactly.
So now let's just go to the Iranian position on that. Wouldn't being a nuclear power be more valuable than any potential restriction? Isn't that their ultimate goal?
Well, you might think that, and I'm sure there are some Iranians that think that. Certainly the Pakistanis thought that when they got in nuclear weapons, but it turns out not to be the case. So what's the first thing that's not the first thing, but when Iran becomes a declared nuclear power, what are Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey going to do? Odds are they're going to become nuclear powers, right? And they will accept the risk of breaking the non-proliferation treaty but for their own security, and they'll say, well, unless somebody's going to come in and guarantee they'll destroy Iran if they fire a nuclear weapon on us, we're going to get our own nuclear weapons. And so you're going to wind up with a nuclear stand, much in the way, when India and Pakistan thought, well, we'll get nuclear weapons and we'll get everything we want now. Well, all you wind up is back with a standoff. That's a problem. So, the Iranian argument is we're sacrificing everything to get a nuclear weapon and we're going to be way better off. Well, that ain't going to turn out to be any more true than North Korea. But here's the problem in the short term. And we've seen this over and over again. Nascent nuclear powers, the first thing they try to do is use that power. We did it. When we had a nuclear monopoly in the 1940s, we had this thing called atomic diplomacy. We used to wave our finger at the Russians like, oh, well, you can't do that because we have nuclear weapons and you don't. And the Russians were like, yeah, for another hour and a half. The Indians and the Pakistanis tried it. They almost went to war. Even the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis, people forget, the Israelis have had nuclear weapons for a decade. Somebody just walked over and slaughtered 1,400 of their people. Because is Gaza worried about a nuclear attack on Gaza? No. But the problem is once you get nuclear weapons, having invested all this energy and sacrifice in doing that, you feel like it ought to give you something, so you're going to try. So the logical thing is Iran becomes a nuclear power. And remember, at this point, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Turkey are not nuclear powers. What Iran will do, could well do, is say, Straits of Hormuz, nobody gets to send oil through the Straits of Hormuz unless we say it's okay, because if you do, we'll nuke you. And you have to agree to, and so we have another energy crisis.
Yeah.
Now, that'll probably get overcome, right? But we're all going to have to live through the crisis and the global recession that results from it.
The bright side of it is the bright side of it tends to be a diplomatic negotiation problem. The downside is, if you brought up Pakistan, I'll never forget being on the air in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm sitting on the air thinking to myself, if this goes bad and you have India and Pakistan exchange nuclear, we may see 100+ million people just vanish from the face of the earth. Pakistan, cooler heads. By the way, India, not always a cool head in those situations, but cooler heads prevailed. Iran may not pass that test. They're far more aggressive.
Let me tell you the backstory on this, because it's not secret, but it's not widely known. When Pakistan and India were actually hauling out the nuclear weapons and thinking about shooting at each other, the U.S. sent a team of target analysts to both countries. And they said, you guys built these things, but you actually don't know anything about the effects that they have because you invested anything in that. So they said, let us, if Pakistan fires all their nuclear weapons at you, let us show you what that looks like. And then if you fire all your nuclear weapons at Pakistan, let us show you what that looks like. And the Indians were like, oh my God, this is like Armageddon. Right. This would be, then they went to Pakistan and they gave the Pakistanis the exact same brief. Let me show you what these nuclear weapons will do. And both sides said, you know what? Maybe not today. Here's to your point about, well, how can we depend on the Iranians being sane? And the answer is we can't. But here's the bigger problem, which is, what do we do if Iran and Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia all have nuclear weapons? Because we've never had this situation before. Almost every nuclear competition that's ever existed in the world has really been
superpowers.
A two-sided, right? Well, it's been a two-sided thing. It's like even Pakistan and India. It's like it's like the classic shootout in the Western. It's like the two guys in the street, right? They're both like, is the other guy going to pull the trigger, right? And those are relatively easier because it's just a two-player game, right? You ever see that with the one Western with Kevin Costner, where open range or something, and then they go out to have a gunfight, and then everybody in the town starts shooting at everybody? So nuclear stability where there are multiple independent nuclear is much, much less stable. This is, for example, why 1914 spun out of control so quickly. It wasn't just a two-player game, right? There was Austro-Hungary and Germany and Russia, everybody making their own decisions, and it spun out of control pretty quickly. So it is a massive, between the likelihood of regional disruption and the potential for real nuclear progression and nuclear war. This is the nightmare scenario. So I go back to your point as, a declared Iranian nuclear state is kind of unthinkable. But you know what? Nobody really wants to invest in doing the opposite except the last president.
It's interesting. Every election cycle, foreign policy and the security of the people should be the number one priority. It's the last thing on anybody's mind. I look back and I'd say, for Bill Clinton and for George W. Bush, history won't remember it this way, but their greatest failure in terms of foreign policy was not anticipating the threat of al-Qaeda. I don't know if I buy failure of imagination. I saw the movie Executive Decision, which came out years before 9/11. But I would say allowing China to build for decades while we were depleting our military.
Right.
That'll go unnoticed by history. Barack Obama's losing of Turkey. I said this to you when it happened. And again, I come at it from a different angle. I look at things biblically, I look at things geopolitically, and I look at things historically. This one falls under an area I normally don't discuss with you, which is biblically. Turkey is that final piece of the puzzle. And it's going to be probably next to cutting a deal with the Taliban, the cause of the war, to exit Afghanistan that Biden then even botched up years later. Big mistakes, but losing Turkey, devastating mistake of the Obama administration.
Well, I don't know if we've lost Turkey, but I will tell you this the crisis of potentially Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Egypt deciding that, well, we have to have nuclear weapons too, and the problems that'll create in the NPT, which requires all kinds of sanctions on them. And so literally the United States would have to be cutting off countries that are crucial for stability in the region. It could not get more ugly. If you remember when India and Pakistan went nuclear, we both sanctioned them both, right? And you know what? It wasn't that big a deal because they weren't really like in the middle of the universe. Indians weren't even our friends. Pakistanis were a long way away. It's before the Afghan war, the first Afghan war. We didn't care. Boy, it ain't going to be a situation in the lead. It's going to be really, really super ugly.
Can I over-summarize and you correct me? I sense from talking to you, there's not a real clear and present danger to Israel right this second. There is a clear and present danger to stability in the region. And because of this region, the world.
Absolutely. This is the greatest instability we've had since 73.
You never know who might be stopping by at 1850 Main Street, and the conversation is just getting started. To get connected, check out 1850mainstreet.com. We don't data mine anyone or sell your information. Subscribe today so you don't miss a single guest or conversation. We'll see you next time here at 1850 Main Street.